Gregory. I don't know. The main thing is that this thing is your mic, so you just want to project it.
Okay.
Sorry.
No. Yeah. It'll kind of follow you. Whatever you're gonna do.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Chairman Williams is tied up with flight difficulties, so will not be joining us today, unfortunately. Various other people are on vacation, but I see we've got Glenn, Yashem, Fitzroy online, as well as David and Gregory here in the room, along with staff and our speaker tonight. I'm really excited about this evening's presentation. Last one of the summer, and it's on a topic that I think is really intriguing and actually has a lot of potential for us. And I'm excited about our speaker this evening because he brings both really strong academic and conceptual chops on the topic, as well as some real life experience working in the city of Detroit to develop a plan around this concept of land value taxation, develop the specifics of it, work with policymakers to move it forward, and it actually now has the backing of the mayor and just has to get approval of the state legislature, I believe, and he'll tell us more about that. But Nick Allen is with us, and we'll be talking about all of that in just a moment. I'd like to flip the agenda, if I could, and spend just a few minutes talking about the work we have ahead for us. I'm going to share my screen. And show you some slides. Thanks. Oops. Doing that. So I want to talk a little bit about what's ahead because we have some decisions to make about schedule. I think I freaked people out last week when I said we were going to be meeting weekly in September and October without a lot of context or explanation. So I want to provide the context and explanation and then share some options for what we may want to do in September and October. So as we go, as we look into the, as we go into the fall, again, we have no meetings in August. In September and October, we're going to be starting to dig into policy proposals. And I'll say more about what those are, but we've got a whole bunch of policy proposals to review. And the reason we need to get through that in September and October, along with having a couple more stakeholder meetings that are in the works and potentially one or two more expert briefings, so we'll talk about that, is that by November and December, we want to be in a place where we can actually develop a package of recommendations and deliberate on them and hopefully come together around consensus. So there's a lot to do over the course of the fall. And this is very much modeled on what the Commission did in 2013. And the starting point for this work is all the great ideas that we have heard from our expert presenters, from stakeholder meeting attendees, from folks who have submitted comments online, ideas we have gleaned from the work of the 2013 Commission, from various reports that ORA has done. We've been compiling these together. They range across a lot of tax areas. Our one criteria is they had to address at least one of our principles. In fact, we have proposals that address all of our core principles. Some are big changes, some are smaller changes, and we're screening them for duplication. We're making sure they are feasible and reasonable policy solutions, but they really range the gamut, and I think will give us a lot of specific things to chew on. The idea is that we will go through them, and at each meeting we will be looking through a bunch of types of proposals that will be grouped together by the type of tax. So at one meeting we might look at a bunch of property tax proposals. At another meeting we might look at a bunch of income tax proposals. I'm hoping that you will be given in advance materials so that you can come in reasonably up to speed on what we're going to be looking at. And you can come in prepared to ask questions and to share your feedback about what we're proposing and what we should move forward on. we as staff and the chair will take what is said in these meetings, and that will then go into shaping Chairman Williams's mark, his initial proposal, the package of recommendations that he thinks can get consensus. And then we'll have a chance, probably in about November, to really talk that through, to debate, to add, to subtract, and so on. 90 proposals, spending at least a few minutes on each. I am thinking that is probably 10 to 15 hours worth of work together. And we could do it a number of different ways. We could keep on our current cadence of 2-hour meetings, for example, evening meetings in our current time slot, or we could move to, say, an early afternoon time slot. 7 2-hour weekly meetings will allow us to get through probably 10 to 15 proposals each time around. Weekly meetings, that's pretty often, but it does give staff a chance to, between the meetings, go back, answer your questions that have come up, and so on. Option B, fewer meetings, longer meetings, covering more ground in each meeting. I want to suggest alternate Fridays. But obviously other times are possible. And then the final option, which Tony put on the table, was the idea of 2 day-long meetings. So we would cover a lot of ground in sort of 2 fell swoops. So that's what I want to suggest as the options. And I will say I have some bias towards option A or option B. Just from a staff perspective, a little easier to manage, but and given that we have a number of people who aren't here, I sort of feel like we should not make a final decision here and now, but I'm open to questions about this, clarifications, or initial opinions, or you can say, one of these options is a no-go for you, and that'll help narrow it down.
Nickel? Can we consider Saturdays? And the reason for a good many of us, we don't have, to be honest, flexibility during the day. It's just, I think getting everyone at this table with flexible schedules I think it's a challenge. So I think Saturday afternoons might be easier to give people less chance of business conflicts. For me, either the 6:30 to 8:30 or a Saturday option would be fine. We could, but during the day it's going to be a challenge.
I agree with that.
I do know, I think some of our commissioners have small kids, and so they might sort of have the opposite set of constraints. So, but I hear you.
But when there's 2 technical questions, when these proposals are digested, will the fiscal impact of them be known to us at the time?
Yeah, mostly I think we are working with Office of Revenue Analysis. They've already scored a whole bunch of them. They've already done fiscal analyses on a whole bunch of them. A bunch of others are pretty obvious. So there may be a few that we don't have. But the major ones and the ones where the revenue impact is most important, we're definitely going to have those.
And do you envision, for argument's sake, assume that we're aiming for budget neutral or close to budget neutral? So would you have kind of a tally of kind of where we are with, because the first meeting might be a meeting where we in effect spend a lot of money, and then we raise a lot of money in the last meeting, so we kind of got to know a little bit about where we're going and where we've been. I know it's not a precise science; you can't do the exactly, but some degree of, I'm for creating this budget hole today because I plan to advocate in 3 meetings from now for a revenue raiser. So we'll have to just work that into the process somehow, right?
Yeah, I think we can do 2 things. One is we can give you a sense of sort of what's the tally over time. But I also think in the end, it's going to come down to what goes into the final package. Because I'm not sure we're going to be able to sort of make group decisions on every one of these 90 proposals, in real time.
And the other thing, and this is perhaps off message, but let's raise it, maybe it's been raised at a meeting, the one meeting I missed, but like, have we made a definitive decision about whether or not we're going to address solutions for the Metro funding? I'm going to call it a precipice. I mean, the impact of Metro having to implement one of their, doomsday scenarios is beyond, and I'll call it apocalyptic, right? So it's not that we can prevent it, but I think we might want to have opinions on if the elected leadership does go down the road of wanting one or more options for revenue enhancements, what will we comment on them? And not necessarily advocate for one of them, but just say, have some comments on it, especially if they relate a lot to some of what we're proposing otherwise. I just don't see how we can not somehow account for that.
So Gregory, I would just make 2 points of what the 2013 commission did, which is always what we did and not what you have to do, but just, so for your first question about the proposals and the revenue costs, when you talk through the memos, there will not be an up or down vote, at least we do not have an up or down vote at the end of it. We're not gonna get anyone on the record, we're not gonna keep a tally. We wanted your opinions, and so I'm strongly in favor of this, I'm strongly opposed to this. Is that will help Chairman Williams, along with Nick and Mike, go back and figure out what are they for and how does that math all make together, and maybe you have a proposal that everyone's really excited about but has big revenue costs, and so but when it comes forward in Karen Mark, it's a little smaller. Because we acknowledge that everyone thinks this is a good idea, but we had to when we put everything together. So just voicing opinions and then for the Metro thing, I would just keep in mind the report is also a tool in your toolkit. And when you put forward the package of recommendations, it is not just because they are revenue neutral or roughly in a ballpark of. It is these tax cuts are needed because of business competition, because of making the tax code fair. These tax cuts are needed for funding the Metro system, which is vital to our economy and its development, and making those points clear why you're pushing them both on the table.
I would say, Tony has said his preference is not to dive into the WMATA shortfall, or this was as of the last time I had a conversation with him was at least a month ago, but rather to put forward revenue options that could be deployed to fill the WMATA shortfall or pay for some other tax
There are
cuts.
certain revenue options that I would put forth. I would think we would put forth only if they were going to go to a WMATA fix, like a gas tax or something. So like you kind of got to know that going in.
Yeah, maybe.
And I think what if we choose not to address it, I think we should be very upfront about why and just be very deliberate about it. But otherwise, I'm mixing all my metaphors, but it's the elephant on the cliff, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
I
Please,
think being very conscious of that, it's like a ghost in the room, Gregory. There will be trade-offs. So I'm eager to explore how we might do that. I'm having spent 6 years on the WMATA board, albeit a while ago. I tell you, I never saw that place make an adjustment. I never saw a cut. I never saw anything approaching a responsible labor agreement. It was simply a giveaway to every union negotiation period. I'll tell you a quick story. We had enough money to right before the tech bust, we had enough money to fully fund our pensions in perpetuity, and it got hung up because the unions wanted half of the amount needed more than what would have been sufficient to pay what they were due. They wanted it. And so we didn't do it. Shortly thereafter, the tech bust happened, and our pension surplus evaporated, and now we are hemorrhaging money every year to a pension we can't afford. All right, so again, this goes a little bit back to what Mayor Williams was saying, but briefly, if we are going to talk about revenues, there has to be a reality check for the WMATA leadership when it comes to expenses. There just has to be. I don't know how we marry those two. Other things I'd like to be on the table, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we have unfunded obligations to the nationals as far as the stadium goes. That's real, and it's not an inconsequential amount. You know the amount more than I do. We have other obligations to our other sports franchises, and there's a discussion of bringing another. And so we have a lot of ghosts of Christmas, past, present, and future, that are wandering around that we need to be mindful of before we spend all the money in other ways. Anyway.
I know Glenn and Yeshim have previously expressed opinions on this topic. I don't know if either of you want to jump in at this point. Maybe not.
Sure, this is Glenn. I'm happy to. Roughly a month ago, WMATA informed stakeholders that they have about a 30% deficit in operations starting next July 1st. And the total dollar value of that they want to distribute to the three principal jurisdictions, which is, of course, the district, Virginia, and Maryland, is about 750 million, and their estimates are that value will grow faster than the rate of inflation moving forward. The district's share of that could be in the range from 250 to 350 million, and very clearly this will be the most significant issue for the district to address in certainly the next year, short of a major recession. And I know, Mr. Catania, that there's a substantial amount of interest in the points that you're making amongst stakeholders. So many of us will be working either with WMATA or just ourselves looking at their books to understand exactly their forecast for this gap and what it means to their service model and so forth. In the end, they are struggling like any other mass transit entity in the country. One could argue about whether or not they've overstated their gap or not. Certainly, we will do our very best to get on top of that in the next few weeks. But the reality is these are complicated hub and spoke type systems that depend on a flourishing office environment in a city center. And whether you're in San Francisco or Boston or here in the district, that's not happening any longer. Their ridership is about 50% of pre-pandemic. Our count of office space use is about 50% of what the pre-pandemic amounts were. So it's a symptom of what's happening to major cities, but this is clearly the most significant issue from my perspective the district is facing, at least right now, short of a major recession. Was that helpful, Nick?
I mean, yeah, depressing. I think it still raises the question of what the commission's specific role is and how to articulate it beyond, as Richard suggested, at a minimum, we could talk about it in our final report as part of the context. But as Gregory points out, we will have a list of potential revenue measures, but some may be seen as more appropriate.
Any revenue that the city has of that magnitude is going to involve revenue raisers, aka tax hikes. So that just seems to me right in the wheelhouse of what a tax commission should be addressing, and especially if, in the CFO's own words, aside from a recession, the single biggest threat on the city's horizon. I'm not sure exact words, Glenn, but the largest issue facing our city fiscally.
Yes, and there's multiple levels to this. If you look at the biggest picture and think about a contraction of service levels of the metro trains into the city center, that many speculate, and this is not just unique to the district, but other major cities, that also adds to the downward spiral of use of downtown real estate. We have no basis to think that's true. In other words, we haven't done independent assessment of that, but certainly it is a concern. But if the district is going to face effectively a large increase in its subsidy. Right now, the district subsidizes WMATA roughly 800 million a year. So if it adds another 200 to 300 million to that, that's a significant portion of our overall $12 billion a year general government budget. So it's a very significant challenge for the district. Again, the numbers are just right now from WMATA, and a lot of work has to be done. But at the moment, if the district is interested in in making sure that that system still is a viable part of its economic future, there will be issues, financial issues for the district to address here very shortly.
So let's do this. I hear the three of you, and I'm sure others who are on and not on the call will agree that this is something we should explicitly tackle. I'll circle back with Chairman Williams, and others are welcome to join me on that call, and we'll come up with a plan for how to shape our work to fit the needs of the moment. Sounds like that's important. Okay. And it's actually a terrific, and then on the more broader scheduling question, I think we have to do it by email, given the number of people who aren't here. And I hear you, David, about trying to avoid conflicting with everybody's day jobs. It's very much appreciated. You guys are volunteers and have more than 9 to 5 jobs you have to put time into. So we will figure something out. But it's a great segue to our main presentation today, because Nick and I were talking about his presentation. He actually said, "Is it possible for me to think a little bit about and share some thoughts about how a land value tax might fit into funding needs for infrastructure such as WMATA?" And I said, "Yeah, I think that might make sense." So unless that's fallen out of your presentation since the last time we talked, I think Nick's going to share some thoughts about one of the possible options for doing just that. So before I turn it over to Nick, anything else we want to touch on? All right, the floor is yours.
Great. Hope everyone can hear me from Owl, and I'm going to attempt to share screen here. I want to thank the Commission for having me down here. I am Nick Allen. I am a PhD student at MIT. And prior to that, I was a city official in Detroit, where, everybody seeing that? Are you seeing?
Oh, that's mine, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where I was a economic development official working in real estate development, and trying to think about ways to capitalize investment in neighborhoods in particular. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done in Detroit, where I've worked really hand in glove with the CFO's office there. And we recently announced the rollout of a land value tax plan for the city. But what I really wanted to do was sort of think about how what we've learned in Detroit could apply here, especially given DC's history of exploring this type of proposal, and what could possibly make that proposal more suited to DC's needs in particular. So I like a good place, I think, to start on this is something that Professor William Vickrey, who is a Nobel laureate and an economist who mostly worked on auctions, said about the property tax. And what sticks with me from this quote is that he says that the property tax is, economically speaking, a combination of one of the worst taxes, the tax on real estate improvements, and one of the best taxes, tax on land or site value. I think that's helpful just to sort of think about this as actually two taxes to begin with. And I don't expect that you'll immediately agree with Vickrey on this question of why it's a good tax and a bad tax. But let me just explain what his intuition is and why I think this is a good way to think about the property tax as two taxes. So in the US, we use what's called a general property tax. Almost all 50 states use it. It is the primary source of local government revenue. And it's been on the books in the US since about 1650. But we did something that was actually uncommon among countries at the time, which is we decided not just to tax land visible assets, but every single type of property that people have. So tangible, intangible property, and so on. And we've kind of rolled that back, but we still have this tax that is two parts. It's a tax on land, and it's a tax on real estate improvements. In some states, it's also on personal property. And I think it's helpful just to think about what that tax on improvements does and what the tax on land does. So imagine that you have a $100,000 parcel somewhere in the city. It's vacant and you're trying to decide whether to develop it or not. So the question before you is, if the city is charging a 1% tax on land and a 1% tax on improvements, how is that going to affect your investment decisions? Well, it's pretty straightforward overall. Let's say you want to build a $400,000 house, or two of them, say like an attached house or row houses for $800,000. I mean, you look at that and it's pretty clear that overall it's going to cost you more to build on that site relative to holding it empty. Now, it may be that the return of building is worth it, but as you look at more and more dense options, that tax penalty is going to become more significant overall. It doesn't mean you won't build to higher density. It'll sort of depend on how much value there is in building at that density. But it's a reason that you might prefer, say, the middle option here rather than the dense option. Let's compare that to just a pure tax on land. And again, this is not something that any jurisdiction in the US does. It's not what I'm here to advocate today, but I think it's just helpful to illustrate. Imagine instead that the jurisdiction wanted to collect revenue through a 5% tax on land. And in fact, if you look at, if there were 3 different properties with the same type of parcel, this would collect the same amount of revenue. The difference here is that you're only being charged based on the access value, the amenities, and the general location value of the land itself, and it doesn't tax your decision of what to do with that land at all. And that's quite different, right? Because what it means is that if a developer is looking at these 3 different options, it becomes very clear that the best option available, provided that it makes sense to do any development at all, would be something that is the most dense use of that land. And the final thing I want to put on the table with this is that there are middle range scenarios here. There's anything between this pure land value tax and general property tax. And that's what we might call a split rate tax. So you could just say, if we need to raise the same $15,000 of revenue across 3 parcels, we could tax land at a 3% rate, and each dollar that we collect from land is a dollar we don't have to collect for improvements. So we can tax land at a 0.5% rate, or about half the rate as before. And you can see, compared to that first scenario, the discouragement to investment is lower on both the single house and the 2 houses on the same parcel. So that's the intuition that I want to build behind it, and we can come back to that idea over time. But I think it's important to say what economists generally agree on about a land value tax. I think there's kind of 5 things that I would point out that different authors have said at different points about this, and I think they hold true, and it's hard to find anybody who disagrees with it. The first is that it tends to be a fairly equitable tax, meaning that its distribution is progressive overall and related to the benefits that people receive from the tax. An important feature of that is that, in general, places that are rapidly appreciating tend to pay more of the tax, and places that are significantly disinvested or face economic challenges pay less of the tax. And that's kind of self-correcting over time as places change. So a good way to think about this is one reason it's a progressive tax is that it minimizes tax burdens in disinvested communities. But the other part of that is that it's quite investment-oriented. As the example that we just talked about explains, a land value tax doesn't discourage you from making the best use of your property. It says you should make that decision based on your own needs and what you think should be done with the property. It's not going to tax what you do with that property. And that means that there's no discouragement in the land value tax to construction or upkeep of the property. The other feature of that is within a competitive taxing environment, multiple jurisdictions competing with one another, it has no impact on how much burden the tax system places on individual investments within that jurisdiction. So it can't reduce DC's local competitiveness. The third feature that's useful about the tax is that it's neutral. Relative to a tax on things that move, a tax on an immobile asset doesn't change where you decide to use that asset. It doesn't shift how you allocate resources, whether across different types of uses or where you place your investments. And it's also very difficult to avoid because you can't move the land out of the city. Fourth feature that's useful is that it's a self-sustaining tax, primarily because when public service values rise, when public service or improvements happen, that raises land values, right? That capitalizes into the value of land. And that means that collecting revenue from land in some ways recovers that value that was created through public services. There are other things that also generate land values, to be clear. It's not just public services. It's all about the amenities in the area. It's about what your neighbors are doing with their property. But there's very little that the owner that themselves do that raises the value of land. And finally, I think it's a relatively simple taxing option overall. And the reason is because it's an existing feature of the property tax. All you need to do is look at the existing rates on land and property. We can talk a little bit about land valuation. I have some slides on that at the end. But it certainly doesn't create new administrative burden for taxpayers relative to, say, reporting on sales or trying to figure out the total capital value of your wealth, for example, which is a relatively difficult thing with infrequently traded assets. And this isn't totally uncommon either. It's more common outside the U.S., which I'll talk about. But there are examples of cities in the U.S. using land value tax for about 100 years. In the United States, all we have are these split rate systems overall, where basically, in general, what happens is that you raise the tax on land and you reduce the tax on improvements. Today, Pennsylvania is the only state using that widely, but there are 17 cities in the state that do. Allentown and Harrisburg are the largest ones currently. And 3 states in total, including Connecticut and Virginia, have authorized this at the local level. So I think Richmond has the option, Wisconsin, to give the local example, also has the option. And what you see when these kind of taxes get passed in the U.S. is there's really kind of 2 things that that cities are interested in doing. One is they might want to increase tax progressivity or reduce tax burdens on residents or seniors. And the second part is that they want a tax that limits negative effects of taxation on business investment. Outside the U.S., there's a broader, there are different types of regimes out there. Some of them are just pure land value taxes. Some of them are taxes on the land rent. Some of them are auctions of land. They all have kind of this character of taxing the rental value of land. Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong really use these as original taxes. I think partly because a lot of the theory around this developed in the 20th century, and these taxing systems came online much later than the U.S. And the other way you see it used very commonly is in cities that do land value capture, meaning that they try and recover the incremental value that the public investments create. Brazil has a very strong system of this in particular. I think what you see in general when countries are sort of dealing with nascent tax systems is they really are trying to do different things. They're trying to limit the taxes on capital investment and earned income. They want to capture the windfalls of, say, upzoning or allowing people new development rights. They want to be able to finance infrastructure and capture the value of that new infrastructure. And I think they want to fund government from spillovers rather than the private value that investments generate. So they don't want to distort decisions people make. They instead want to make sure that they're capturing value that's either socially created or publicly created. So that brings me to Detroit. And I want to talk a little bit about how Detroit is quite different than DC. I'll stress that very strongly here. But I think that motivates the discussion of what DC might do. So the first thing to know about Detroit is that if you compare, it's sort of a different league in terms of its residential tax burdens. I believe the number here is 0.85% is the residential tax rate. Detroit, depending on the year, is about 4 to 5.5% in many of the tracts around the city. And that, of course, means that Detroiters pay very high taxes on a very low base of residential values. That tax rate is 2 or 3 times the rate of surrounding jurisdictions. And what that's meant over time is Detroit has lost capital stock and residence because of this very high tax rate. And a lot of those homes have essentially been rebuilt in lower tax jurisdictions outside the city. And that's a big problem to address. It's meant that Detroit's tax base is very unstable over time. A second feature of that is that as Detroit's tax base has declined, it's has to raise rates almost continuously, well, really since about 1910. But since the significant decline of the city's tax base in the 1960s, when it lost about 80% of its value, Detroit has doubled its millage rate. And of course, that's sort of a death spiral problem, right, where you continue to tax at a higher and higher rate on a lower and lower base. A third feature that's pretty challenging is that the fixes to this problem of excess burdens on residential, but also on new real estate development, is that they're fairly inequitable and pretty uneven. One thing Detroit does is they offer 15-year tax exemptions, sort of equivalent in size to the homestead exemption here. But the uptake on these is fairly low. They focus on high and middle market neighborhoods throughout the city. They do a lot to actually sustain the mortgage markets in those areas. They unlock a lot of financing. But overall, they tend to be used by a small minority of Detroiters. And that means that a lot of markets are effectively locked out and into a tax system that is pretty difficult to sustain. So we wanted to do 4 things in Detroit. Overall, we wanted to relieve costs for owners and renters in the city. And I think that was the basic principle, is that we really needed to find a way to reduce residential taxes in particular. We wanted to find a way to attract investment without dealing through exceptions only. And we thought that that might also create more inclusive economic development patterns, in which it isn't just people who know how to sort of procure a tax abatement or cleverly finance a deal with TIF structuring and other things, that it would make a lot of smaller developments make sense. And finally, we wanted to keep this revenue neutral. The city went through a bankruptcy in 2014. It's very important to maintain revenue neutrality and to grow revenues over time. And so we wanted a way to encourage investment and tax-based growth, but make sure to replace every dollar that we would give up if we were going to reduce a tax. The last thing that I'll just say about this is I think that in Detroit, at least, we thought about a land value tax as an alternative to discretionary abatements, tax incentives, and exemptions. The differences are that a land value tax, in fact, also abates taxes on new investment, but it does so in a way that's universal. It doesn't vary by property. It's permanent. It doesn't go away in year 15, and suddenly you're paying 4 times the tax rate that you were before. And it's unconditional. There are no barriers to access. We don't create an application process. We just wanted to reduce everybody's taxes and reduce taxes on new investment going forward. And I'll just briefly mention that we did a major study on this, thanks to the Kresge Foundation and the Lincoln Institute and the OCFO of Detroit. The bottom line here is that when we looked at an option to implement a split rate tax in this revenue neutral way in Detroit, we found that we could save taxes for about 98% of residents in a fairly straightforward way, that we could raise residential property values by about 10%. I'll skip and say over to business and say we noticed when we looked at Pennsylvania's experiments with this, very large gains in business formation in split rate cities, and large gains in commercial property value. And finally, on the local government side, we did some modeling, some fiscal forecasting using these assumptions about tax base growth, and found basically recovery in Detroit's tax base over time. We were able to demonstrate lower levels of tax delinquency, and overall, we're reducing the draw on people who have the least ability to pay in the city. So Mayor Mike Duggan, who's been the mayor of Detroit since 2014, announced this plan just 2 months ago now, and basically said, look, the property tax system that we have is one that is punishing buildings and rewarding blight. We've been talking with different constituencies about this. We've been putting together a state legislative campaign, but I think that the intuitive economics are pretty straightforward for people to grasp, and that's been pretty exciting to talk with different constituencies about. It doesn't make it easy. Anytime you talk about a major tax reform, and particularly raising the tax on land by about 3 times, there's a lot of people who are ill at ease with that. But I think that we've been able to sort of convincingly show how important this is to making sure that Detroit does not continue to have its tax base be an impediment, or its tax system be an impediment to recovery. So I think that to transition on this, the way that I think about this is what a land value tax is not. There are some people who will say that a land value tax is somehow going to magically generate development and investment, and it doesn't do that. It just doesn't punish productive activities in the way that many other taxes do. It doesn't discourage and it doesn't distort what people do with investment decisions, with where they choose to live, in the income they choose to procure. So a land value tax, by contrast, is neutral. The way that it becomes quite progressive or quite investment oriented is by replacing taxes that aren't, or by funding really important critical infrastructure, I'll say. I think of this in kind of 3 different ways. You could use it to improve equity, and I'll say in DC's context, you could do things like raise the maximum homestead exemption to increase progressivity. You could make homestead exemptions tenure neutral. You could choose to raise investment levels instead by, say, reducing the taxation of new commercial property in the city, or by reducing the overall rate of commercial improvements. Or you could, say, recover windfalls. So if their upzoning occurs in a particular neighborhood, when that raises land values, you recover more of the value generated rather than having it be a private gain. The last thing I'll say, too, is I think it's a useful way to think about creating a basis for pilot payments. I don't presuppose that is a conversation in the district right now, but I will note that land values helpfully describe how individual property owners, including tax-exempt property owners, are generating from the location they sit in, or are generating value from the location they sit in. And it's a useful way to think about what might be a basis for pilot payments because of that.
So you're talking about pilot payments by nonprofit institutions? for
Yes,
instance.
exactly. Yeah. So tax-exempt institutions that don't pay, what is it that they're actually getting from public service value? And how would that be rationally related to the benefits they receive from public services? So let me just talk through some very nuts and bolts work on what this might look like in the District of Columbia. I do want to acknowledge that I'm not the first person to do this. The Tax Reform Commission in 1998 put this as a chapter in their report, Taxing Simply and Taxing Fairly, where they ran through about 5 different scenarios that they could look at. And I've tried to implement some of that work. And then Yeshin was also kind enough to write an article in 2019.
It's amazing.
And sorry, Yeshin, I think I inverted your first and last name there. Was kind enough to look at this in the context of the other challenges with development in the city, particularly the constraints that zoning create. So I want to emphasize again that I don't think this is a magical cure for things like the constraints in the housing market from say from density caps or unit or lot minimums and stuff like that. But I think it's a helpful way to sort of make sure that there aren't other things getting in the way of housing construction. So just a quick look at what we're talking about with the tax base overall. Land assessments in DC are quite different throughout the city, much like improvements are. But overall, between the lowest value per square foot neighborhoods and the highest value per square foot neighborhoods, there's about 100 times differential. So downtown, values are around $3,000 to $3,500 a square foot. In Southeast DC, in particular, you can find land values at about $30 a square foot. I want to emphasize that these are using the tax records today, and the assessor does not make warranties that these are perfect records of land value. There are limits on the local accuracy of these assessments, and I think it would be important to make sure that people feel confident, which I'll discuss at the end, in the valuations in the city before pursuing anything like this. And the last thing I'll say and just note is that you'll see that actually, while tax exemption is a major feature of the property tax system, it is a particularly important feature of the land tax base. And I'll just show that downtown really quick. Here's your areas of highest land value in the city, and here's what's tax exempt. And you take that all away. So overall, when you just run the sort of quick and dirty numbers on this, there's a greater concentration of land among tax-exempt institutions, which is actually kind of intuitive, because if you're tax-exempt, you have no incentive to use your land efficiently, relative to tax-exempt buildings in the city. So about 46% of the land tax base is tax-exempt, which I think is actually a challenge to implementing a land value tax in a consistent way. So let's talk about different approaches that DC could use. I want to take 2. One would be a revenue-neutral split rate tax, and the other would be a revenue raiser. So I modeled this out as basically a 3-to-1 split rate. And let me talk about what that means. Overall, the goal is to keep the total revenue that the city collects constant. For every dollar that you collect in land taxes, you would remove $1 in taxes on investment until you're at a 3-to-1 sort of rate differential between buildings and land. The other thing, and this is something I did different than the 1998 study, is I chose to preserve the existing tax differentials. So you'll see on the right-hand side in this table, the way that I've done this is that you keep the 3-to-1 ratio for residential and the commercial separate. So that, say, residential land is being taxed at a 1.4% rate, and commercial land is being taxed at a 2.71% rate, and they get corresponding reductions in their building burden. I also want to stress a couple things. This is a static model. It says, here's what happens if nothing changes in the economy. And that's simply not true, right? Things change in the economy when you tax differently. It doesn't estimate how asset values would change if you tax them differently, and it doesn't estimate how people would change their behavior if you, say, reduce taxes on investing in property. And I'll also just say that the land assessments restrict how much accuracy I can have if you're using those as the basis of these overall. So looking across different classes of property, and I'm only looking at commercial and residential here because they're the largest components of the tax base. There's also classes, as you may know, for vacant and blighted property. Overall, what you see is that in the residential tax roll, there's the most significant savings are primarily to denser buildings, so apartments and condos in particular. Single family and small multifamily units see small increases overall, on the order, I think, of about 6% is what I was finding. And I'll talk about where that is in a second. And on the commercial side, I should check that again. Commercial parking shouldn't be a reduction. Overall, office gets the largest reduction. Yeah, the commercial parking is wrong in the top. I'll fix that. Overall, office space gets the largest reduction. And by comparison, say commercial parking, including parking garages, and vacant commercial holdings that are not classified as vacant are different. Yeah, Yeshin, you want to jump in? I'm not hearing you yet in this room. Are you muted?
She's muted.
Yeah, somebody has to do it. Sorry. This is really awesome. I just want to raise a few points that are really important. I think a land value tax is a really promising way to encourage developments in DC, and perhaps in the long run, maybe break the resistance against zoning requirements. But I just want to warn, and Nick, you and I have talked about this earlier today. It would be important to get the CFO's view on this, because I'm not sure if the land versus building values, the way that they're split right now, are actually reflecting the land versus building values or some historic assessment practices. It would be important to know that. And if they are historic practices, all of this stuff that you're showing us is essentially some assessor's decision back in 2002 that is just being reflected, and we should know that better. And then there are a bunch of properties in DC that are assessed using the income method, which means that we treat them like stocks. We take their net operating revenue and divide them by some, interest rate. The land value tax or the split rate tax will not be appropriate for them, because we're not even looking at the land versus the building. We're just looking at the income generating capacity. I do think that this proposal is most useful for residential property that's not multifamily, single family, detached row houses and things like that. But outside of that, we pretty much value the buildings using an income approach, and I'm not sure if this is useful. I do, however, think that this is a fruitful way for the Tax Revision Commission to think about the future of residential property taxes. There is a great amount of institutional restraints on growth in DC, and incentivizing buildings is an important goal, and I think the land value tax will be a meaningful way to get there. Thank you.
Well, I guess the question, do you want to get through the rest of your slides and then
Sure.
get into?
Do you have?
Home stretch here, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I'm in the home stretch here.
Oh, please, then go ahead.
Great. Let me just wrap up. So, Yeshin, thank you for those disclaimers. And I do want to stress that too, that I think, especially with the different methods of land valuation, and not having had a conversation about the veracity of the land assessment records, it's difficult to know. I can say there are definitely some frailties in particular neighborhoods that I noticed looking at these land valuations, where there's just like a fixed percentage land value. But I also, I think that overall, for example, we can feel fairly confident about, say, the gradient of land value throughout the city relative to, but maybe less confident about like the local accuracy within a neighborhood. And I'll talk a little bit about how DC could improve its land valuations if it wanted to take this approach. The other thing I just wanted to note in this model where we save as much on improvements as we pay in land value, is that the residential tax impacts are kind of heterogeneous. So you'll see that the savings are really concentrated in Southeast DC and along the 16th Street corridor, everywhere from, I think, kind of Columbia Heights to Adams Morgan, and then down through the kind of apartment buildings near downtown. What I observed from this is that there's kind of two things going on. One is that there's a significant amount of tax relief in some fairly economically challenged areas of the city. But the other thing is that where density is limiting the amount of housing construction available, particularly in the kind of R1 districts in the northeast and northwest of the city, the land tax is actually coming in and raising the tax rate on those properties. And of course, you could fix that by upzoning some of those properties, or if you, say, built an ADU on those properties, you would kind of make out even on this kind of reform. But I'd also just point out that if you wanted a more progressive structure, instead of implementing this as a split rate, you can instead take all the saving, or take this new residential tax, land tax, and structure it as a larger exemption on shelter. Basically say, let's untax improvements in general, let's do it for homesteads at a deeper rate, and maybe even let's do it for renters and multifamily properties. So the second thing and the final thing I wanted to approach before concluding this was really looking at this question of the WMATA revenue shortfall. So the second thing I wanted to examine is what would happen if you implemented this as a revenue raiser for transit. The premises there would be that a transit service should be funded by the land premiums that it generates. If there's a premium on locations near the station, one way to capture the value around those stations is to tax the land. And the other nice thing about that is while you're taxing the land, you're also allowing people to use land at its highest and best use around the station, which is exactly what you'd want if you're looking to restore, say, service capacity at a station, is more people living around the stations. I want to emphasize this is not a revenue neutral model. What I'm assuming here is about a $300 million in additional funding purely from a higher land value tax. I'm applying a uniform 0.31% land value tax rate to both commercial and residential. So everybody's paying the same tax. And that's actually where this would be a purely neutral tax. So I think there's more work to do on this particular scenario, especially if this is a conversation that the commission is thinking about having. But I just wanted to make some brief comments on who would pay such a tax right now. And I was a little surprised to see this, honestly. The question for me was, is a land value tax more concentrated around stations than the property tax is today? As in, would people nearer stations pay a greater share than they do of their property tax? The answer is actually no, according to the land valuations we have right now, which either says that we need to really evaluate those land valuations, or that something else important is going on, say with low density development and excess land resources elsewhere in the city. But I think it's worth looking into, is what I'm trying to stress here. The bottom line here is that across all the three classes that I evaluated here, there's actually less concentration of land tax base around transit stations as you get nearer to them than there is within the property tax today. So I just leave that as an observation. I don't really have a theory of why that is right now. All right, so bottom lines, what can I offer from Detroit, given that this is a very different city system and a different set of challenges? I'd say with respect to thinking about a land value tax, the most important thing is to decide what you're replacing. What is it that you want to fund with the land value tax, and what makes it worthwhile to talk about the stakes of a new tax? So I've proposed some options for that, and I'll leave you with some final recommendations. The other things I just want to say is that there are other challenges in implementing this. You need to think about this question of, do we continue with rate differentials, or do we have a uniform land value tax across all classes? You would need to think about any existing abatements and TIF districts to make sure that those are either held harmless, or that you have some plan to deal with owners who would say see a large tax increase because their improvements are abated. I think it's important to think about the transition planning. I have to emphasize that this would interact with the existing caps, say like the 10% cap on residential property in DC. So making sure that that the district answers for that would be important. In Detroit, we've structured this as a 3-year phase-in, so that the market would have time to adjust. The fourth thing is thinking about other regulatory burdens. One thing we've dealt a lot with in the taxing system. So I think zoning is expressed in land values. One thing we've really been challenged with is parking minimums in the city, because every time we want a business to make an investment, they also have to add a huge amount of surface parking, which adds to their land inventory. And so we just chose to exempt parking areas from the tax. I hope in the future we'll just exempt owners from having to carry large excess parking areas. And the fifth thing is, I'd say there is the precursor for any of this work is consistent, valid assessments of land. If you were to propose to look at this in DC, I think there are maybe 3 options that could, it's a choose any of 3, including all 3. But I think the most promising to me, particularly thinking about the Commission's goals of greater progressivity and equity and also greater investment potential, would be this universal shelter exemption, like a higher homestead that applies to everybody. A reduction in taxes on commercial improvements that invites investment back into the city and also reduces burdens on very well-utilized properties in the city. And the third would be a revenue raiser to contribute to WMATA funding for the reasons that we talked about, that there are these local premiums that stations generate. So the last thing I just wanted to comment on was what you would do if the constraint on doing this, or the limiting factor, is the quality of the land valuations. I just wanted to give some encouraging news on that. In general, the way that I think about this is that relative to, say, assessing the entire value of property, urban land values are harder to observe because less vacant land sells than regular buildings or row houses, for example, in DC, but they're pretty spatially predictable. So that means that a lot of the improvements that have been made in mass appraisal models, including regression-based models and Kriging, have really improved the way that we can look at valuation with sparser land records. And there's actually some amazing scholars here in DC, including William Larson at the FHFA. The IAAO has some people here locally, Paul Bedanza in particular, who are doing a lot of work on improving land assessments, either in the academic research space or for mortgage appraisers or with tax appraisers. You can also improve the sample of vacant land sales by using teardowns as a proxy. Because anytime somebody sells a property and tears it, or sells a property, purchases a teardown, they're essentially purchasing the land only. And so that's a useful way, if you're tracking teardowns, to add to the sales and improve the validity of assessments. And I did mention that there are a lot of experts standing by who are really motivated to work on this. So I would encourage that the commission could reach out to those. That's what I have. Thank you for digesting a lot of information. I hope it was interesting, if a little, tax heavy. And thanks again for having me here.
Thanks so much, Nick. David, you want to dive in?
Thank you. I think it's interesting. I don't know if we're, if I'm honest, I'm not sure this is a model that we actually need as much as in Detroit. If I'm not mistaken, 40 square miles of the 140 square miles of the city is vacant. Mm-hmm. So you have 30% of the property of the city that is simply not utilized. We don't have that problem.
Sure.
We're burdened by, and I live in this neighborhood, you may as well, historic neighborhoods, which obviously is going to limit our development in those communities. Mm-hmm. We have caps on the height of our buildings, which also makes land more valuable. So we have these limitations that are slightly different. I don't know if we have, I'll speak for myself, I don't know if we have, at least over the last few years, our limitations have been more regulatory than they have been inviting capital, which makes us slightly different than Detroit. I mean, we all root for the city and so on, but we have people kind of, or had within the recent past, people falling all over themselves to come. And it's a matter of how soon they can get approvals and building permits and certificates of occupancy in less than 12 months and so on. But I think we have just a different set of circumstances. And what I would be very careful about is, like, this is interesting, but what's going to help us with our particular challenges here? We, like Detroit, we all need to raise money. We're here for the earlier part of the discussion. And what I want to be careful of is that we don't fall along the same path that Detroit did in the past, where the taxes eventually came so high that people found greener pastures on the other side of the city line and cleared out 1 million people.
Yep. Yeah, I guess I thanks for raising those differences, because I completely agree, and I think it's important to articulate that we're not trying to accomplish the same things with a land value tax in Detroit as we would in DC. I think the way that I have seen it is, the question is, in a challenging fiscal environment right now in the district, what is the least damaging, most competitive way to raise revenue overall? And the clear answer to me on that would be a land value tax. I think there's a lot of economics research that says that because it does not distort investment decisions, because it encourages people to use property at its best use, and because its burdens are relatively light on new capital formation. Like there's no additional cost. So if the goal is to raise additional revenue, I think that's where this has some value.
And what was intriguing was the application on a pilot basis of nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if we're clearly trying to create the most, you know, everyone likes nonprofits, fine. But if we assume that we can't run a government based on the revenue and nonprofit uses, and that we need revenue, it seems to me that we need to make sure that the nonprofits who are sitting on a pile of value have some skin in the game. So I live in DuPont Circle, just very quickly, and you can imagine some of the nonprofits that are in our neighborhood, right? I mean, AEI just spent, I don't know, like $1 billion renovating their tax-exempt property, and we get nothing. Do you know what I mean? So I'm interested in this application to nonprofit property as a way to incentivize their highest and best and conscious use of the consequences of their not paying taxes on the population. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
But it doesn't have to be equal to what we expect of a commercial or a for-profit enterprise. But I would be very interested in how we might do that here.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I thought that was a really interesting, compelling, provocative presentation. I better maybe read it 2 or 3 more times to absorb a little bit more of it each time. It was a lot of it was, as you said, very tax dense. But I do think I agree with a lot of what David said. It's not a great choice. Is not a good model for anything for us really. And so I just wish it were
Although we root for Detroit. We root for Detroit.
Not in baseball.
No, we root for Detroit. We root for all the efforts undertaken to reverse what was the wealthiest city in the world 70 years ago.
So, but you said something that the primary impact here is for denser commercial buildings than single-family dwellings, correct?
When you say the impact, what do you mean by
In
that?
terms of the incentivizing different sorts of behavior.
I think you would incentivize denser development everywhere. The bottom line of the land value tax is you would get greater capital density everywhere.
But to David's point, much of our city is by current zoning and the comp plan and historic designations is never going to be larger than what it is now. We're not going to tear down our row houses and build 10-story buildings. So at some point, all of the vacant land that we have, the large majority of it is currently low value areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to where the land value is probably relatively low now anyway, so there's a relatively low tax burden to start with.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that incentivizing, is this a way of, and if our goal, one of our main goals is to have more affordable housing in the city,
mm-hmm.
would the goal be that on those underused areas, more housing would be forthcoming? Is that where this goes? I mean, that's one of our primary goals, is to have more affordability.
So my short answer is yes, but you have a greater expert in the room in Yeshem, who has written quite at length about this question. So Yeshem, can I defer to you on this?
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gregory and David, that zoning does play a role in limiting what we can build and cannot build. But imagine a place where zoning is really restrictive and we do adopt a land value tax. That is purely a stick and no carrot, whereas we want to think of land value taxes as carrot by building more relatively what we would have done otherwise. But I still think that's valuable because there is a great amount of resistance to zoning reform in the city. So if we do adopt something like a land value tax, we might in the long run break that resistance, which is really important. So I do agree with you that zoning is an impediment. I actually wrote about this in the past, but right now we really don't have a way of breaking that resistance to development, and land value taxes can serve as a way to break that. Thank you.
Yeah, on the metro thing, it was fascinating kind of overlap of compelling issues. So there are current commercial buildings adjacent or on top of metro stations vacant, where the owners almost want to walk away and just give it to the bank because they can't get tenants. So raising the taxes on that just seems counterintuitive.
Reducing the taxes on investment, including conversion of the building, would still allow, so it would allow you to maintain, stabilize some of the land value that you collect, right? But also allow that owner to say, recapitalize the building in a different way, invest in the building, change the use of the building. It's allowing, if that building is becoming rapidly obsolete, it's a way to allow different decisions on that site. So it's getting out of the way of using the building at its highest use.
It still requires some principal a considerable investment by the owner to do whatever the destiny of the building is.
Yep. Yeah, but I don't think it's not necessarily true that the taxes in the building would be raised. It sort of depends on what's going on with the assessments now. And it means that if the owner, so if you were to adopt this split rate approach instead, right? Or if say you just purely put a land value tax on the building, what that would do is make sure that the owner is not punished for, say, thinking about changes in use in the future, or for the owner is not punished for changing uses in the future or having to, do significant investments in the building to make sure they can continue to operate it.
That chart that you showed at one of the first slides about where the impact would be to whom or what types of buildings.
Yeah.
Was the end of that revenue neutrality or?
Yeah.
It was.
Yes, and one of the findings with that is actually higher density buildings, including office buildings, would see tax reductions in the kind of simple, straightforward model of splitting the rates.
So I live in the first row of single-family homes off the Central Employment District. So my rates would skyrocket.
It would depend on the zoning and historic designations on the property now. You could look at your land values and answer that question. Right? I'm not sure, honestly, because if you're already at the highest use allowed in that site, then there's no change. I mean, you actually have the highest use now, and you would basically be neutral.
I thought Yeshua was suggesting, and Yeshua, if I misunderstood, that we would use this rate to somehow nudge changes in zoning.
In the long run, for sure. In the short run, yes, there are lots of places in DC where zoning is the primary impediment to growth. But David, you have to think about why property assessments grow. Do they grow because I put like a stainless steel refrigerator in my house or painted my fences the right color? Or do they grow because there are good schools around my house, there's public safety, high quality retail, whatever. These are all investments that are outside of my decision, but ultimately they do capitalize in my home values. So the question that's facing DC is, do we say, okay, it's okay for those things to capitalize in individual values, or do we want some of that back? And if we do want some of that back, and land value tax is a good way to go at that. And in the long run, it can also break resistance towards zoning restrictions, but it does affect current homeowners who have certain expectations about their value growth. And I think that's a very important question for us tax commissioners to ponder. I don't have a view one way or the other.
But Yeshua, let's just use this as a quick example, not to have this degenerate into kind of this rabbit hole of one example, but people make choices and they buy homes and they pay deed and recordation taxes and they make decisions on where they live based on the amenities. So that is getting baked into the price they paid for the home and the incomes that come in those communities and the kinds of amenities those communities with those incomes produce. So while I may not individually be responsible for the Michelin restaurants in my neighborhood collectively, because this environment has been created over time, it does that. So while individually I may not, but the community collectively does. But under what I understand this to be, collectively the community will wind up paying more for the land value. Because
Absolutely, David. There's actually a name for it. It's called the transitional gains trap. Lots of economists actually worked on this in the context of home ownership or even like taxi cab medallions, because whoever has the first dibs in this, like basically capture all the gains and everybody else is just paying the marginal cost or marginal benefits. That is all for sure true. And we all do make these decisions and hoping that our homes near metro stations or near good schools actually appreciate a lot. But in the end, for the city, we cannot be captured by this sort of like this transitional gains trap. We have to find a way to maximize the return on the city's investments or the private investments in the neighborhood. I don't, as I said, I'm agnostic about this, but I'm just saying that we really have to think about how we are taxing residential property.
I hear what you're saying, Yeshua, and I understand that. I just disagree entirely with the premise.
Okay.
I just think
First, David.
because that premise is what led to the Halloween out of Detroit.
I'm not sure that's true. I think it's impressive that you say that, but I think that's like totally
There's a whole bunch of complex issues that led to the Halloween out of Detroit, but it is indisputed that they went from 1.6 to 600,000 people. That taxes, crime, and a whole host of other things contributed to it. And I can't put my thumb on the scale in favor of any system that unless we are tethered to the land and capable of moving, and I am required to stay on Newport Street until I die, if you continue to layer taxes on a certain group of people, eventually they cry uncle, and the next thing you know, you have a bunch of people who are there who cannot support a city financially.
That's a really good point, because I don't know if people are more sensitive to property tax changes or income tax changes. That's a very valid point. But I think, David, at this point that we should save these discussions to our meetings later on when we kind of ponder our different options. Certainly, there are many margins. I do grant you the point, but I also think that there is something about real property taxes which favors existing owners against future owners, and we need to think about that as well.
What does this regimen do in general for commercial competitiveness with Maryland and Virginia?
So if you reduce taxes on investment, it would increase competitiveness. If you simply implement a land value tax, it has no effect on competitiveness. That's the way I think about it. It might say reduce the cost of acquiring land in the city, but overall, the appeal of a land value tax is that it's neutral. It doesn't change how investors make decisions and where they place investments. Rick, did you want to chime in on that?
Actually, let me add something to it, because the way we value commercial property is basically like an income generating. We value commercial property as if they're stocks, which makes it very hard to divide the value between land and improvement. I think the land value tax is most appropriate for single family residential. Outside of that, it's very limited in DC.
That's true. Is that true? Do you think?
About it being more appropriate for residential than income producing properties?
Yeah, I mean, couldn't you just, isn't the land value essentially, I mean, the income you get from a property is a function of where the property is located as well as what's built on it.
Mm-hmm.
No, Nick. It's entirely based on net operating incomes. Independent of the land or the building, you're basically selling a stock and hoping a return on it.
But you can get more money from a property if it's located in an optimal location than in a non-optimal location. So the income stream reflects in part the value of the land and in part the value of what you built on the land.
That may be so, but it's very hard to divide the value between land and improvements.
Can I ask how you?
Like saying how much of Apple stock is based on factories versus retail stores. We just don't know.
So I agree with Yeshim that it is that in general there has been less advancement in income capitalization approaches to land valuation. I'm going to give a very narrow answer on this. It is done. I think in general the replacement cost approaches that exist are stronger overall, and those are more common in the residential market today. But it doesn't. I don't think I wouldn't immediately preclude being able to separate location rents from building rents.
So we'd have to look into that.
You'd have to look into it. Yeah, and it's not something I know a lot about.
May I have one last question?
Yeah.
The difference between the commercial building and commercial property, that one would pay more, one would pay less. Do you factor in the value of the parking itself to the commercial operation and the stream of revenue that it contributes to the larger operation, or do you divorce the two?
Stream of parking revenue.
In other words, let's assume that the parking revenue in the district is 10% of the value of the property and 10% of the value of the property and of the revenue earned.
Yep.
So if we start to tax that differently, what are those implications for the whole building? And one thing I want to be careful of is that we're trying to get people to come back downtown, and if we force costs onto parking, therefore raises those costs. I mean, maybe there's some incremental increase in ridership, but there could be some other unintended consequences where people just say, screw it, I'd like to work from home.
Sure. I have not thought about parceling out parking in particular in these kind of models. I guess the way that I think about it is that I'm trying to think about how parking revenue would function within, because it's not really a function of the land itself.
I'm just curious, if you have a chance to think about this on your flight home and you can let us know,
Sure.
It's fascinating to see how these things interplay with each other.
Sure, I'll give it some thought. I mean, the way that we've thought about it in Detroit is that we require parking, which is a little different than, say, the commercial parking revenue that that isn't required under zoning. But I'd have to think a little bit more about where commercial parking factors into whether it's effectively a land rent or a building rent.
Glenn or Fitzroy, you guys have anything you want to ask or add to the conversation? I got some.
I think they're under their desk at the thought of having implemented.
Yes, you're right.
I wasn't able to print it out, but I sent it around in an email. I encourage you to take a quick look as someone who's been thinking about this in regards to the district for a long time, and I know Yeshim has cited his work in some of her papers.
Would it be appropriate for me to say a few things?
Sure, go ahead.
So a couple things occurred to me. First, I thought Nick's presentation was excellent. I also thought the questions were really good too. One thing that was talked about was the impact on nonprofits. Obviously, they're tax exempt, so does this apply to them? One of the things that's interesting about nonprofits is while they don't pay taxes, they do pay their water fee, they pay their electric bill, right? When you transform the property tax by reducing the tax on buildings and increasing the tax on land, you're transforming the property tax from a tax into a fee. Because the difference between a tax and a fee is, with a tax, you're paying something for generalized benefits, but there's no correlation between what you pay and what you get, or between what you pay and what you're costing the public. A fee, you're paying for particular benefits, more like a price. Or you're paying for the cost that you're imposing. So if I dump sewage, I have to pay a fee for that. Land value represents the benefits that an individual property owner gets from the city. So when people pay based on the value of land, they're paying in proportion to the benefits received. It's more like a fee than a tax. And on that basis, it would be interesting to see if you could compel nonprofits to pay it, because it would be more like a fee than a tax. So that's one thing that I would say on that score. The other thing that was raised was, what if we're trying to raise money for Metro, and what is the impact on our competitiveness? I think there's an interesting case study in Pittsburgh. So in Pittsburgh, they implemented the split rate tax in 1913. And I won't go into the long history of it. It's quite interesting, especially what happened during the Great Depression. Pittsburgh land values did not tank like they did in other cities, primarily because of the split rate tax. That's another story. What I did want to do is talk about, I believe it was the late 60s or early 70s, Pittsburgh had, I believe, a $200 million shortfall in their budget. And their mayor proposed to fill the gap with a wage tax. And that wage tax was going to cost the average Pittsburgh family about $200 a year. And a lot of people on the council screamed bloody murder. They were worried that jobs would move out of Pittsburgh. And people on the council said, well, we've already got the split rate tax. What if we just raise the tax on land value instead of a wage tax? And they raised their money, and it cost the average Pittsburgh family $80 a year instead of $200. Why? Well, because most of the value of Pittsburgh land was in the downtown commercial area, right? So it fell primarily on commercial property. A lot of people then said, well, this is going to kill the downtown. All the businesses downtown are going to move away. After this, what Pittsburgh did, the council actually trashed the mayor's proposal. They passed the increase in land tax. They raised the tax. Instead of being twice the rate on buildings, it was 4 times the rate of buildings. Downtown Pittsburgh went through what was called Renaissance 2. There was a huge boom in building and development downtown Pittsburgh after they increased the tax on land in downtown. So even though all the pundits said, oh, businesses will flee downtown, downtown will become a ghost town, the exact opposite happened. And a land value tax is one of those very weird things, because typically taxes drive whatever you're taxing away. So if you tax jobs, they leave. If you tax buildings, people will invest elsewhere. But if you tax land, you tend to promote its development and intensify its development. So if you're looking for a way to increase DC's competitiveness with the suburban jurisdictions or with other cities of similar size and character, this would do it, because not only are you taxing land, which is, as Nick said, neutral, but in conjunction with that, you're reducing the tax on buildings, and that's where you get your competitive advantage. So the tax on land is neutral, but by reducing a tax that is not neutral, you gain a competitive advantage, and that's something that's important to understand. So, thanks for letting me butt in, and I'm happy to answer other questions or concerns that may come up later. Thank you, Eric.
I think my final word is I have no idea whether this makes sense or not. I find it intriguing, I find it provocative, I find it very interesting. I think it's exactly the sort of thing we should be tackling and thinking about. We're not doing an annual budget, we're doing an every 10-year plan. So we should have things that are transformative and big. And maybe at the end we find out that it doesn't work and it doesn't fulfill our 4 buckets. But it's really the kind of thing that we ought to be thinking of that has a chance of being transformative and changing behavior and incentivizing things in a big way over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I hope we keep it on the list as something worthy of further
further discussion and see where it takes us. But I don't think too that we should be totally dissuaded by the difficulties in implementation. Anything very different is always difficult to do, and it's difficult to do anything the first time. But you do it, and eventually you look back 30 years from now and you say, I'm really glad we did it, and it was hard. But big things are hard, and I don't think we should necessarily take it off the list just because it's hard.
It wasn't easy in Detroit, for what it's worth.
That's still not done in
It's
Detroit,
not
right?
done.
There are still roads to cross. Okay, that's a great final word. More discussion of this and other topics to come. Expect an email survey from me about scheduling options for the fall, and get excited about reviewing lots of policy proposals, including this one and many others, as we go forward. Have a great rest of your summer, and we will see you in September.
Thank you, River.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.